Chapter 1. Jerusalem, Israel. He barely glanced at the pedestrians on either side of Jaffa Road, one of the longest and oldest streets in Jerusalem. He'd never been much of a tourist, and this day was no different. He paid no attention to Safra Square or other landmarks, as the cab made its way from the old city to downtown. Instead, he spent the time studying his notes and answering emails to his boss. The partnership they'd put together was a complicated one, and he didn't want to make a mistake with the registry. Far too much was at stake. He'd spent most of the trip to Israel examining the limited partnership papers to make sure he had all the players identified correctly. "We're here, sir." The driver pulled the cab over to the side of the road. The man looked up from his notes. 216 Jaffa, the Ministry of National Infrastructures? The cab driver pointed at a small sign near the building. Spotting both address and name, the man paid the cab fare, including a generous tip, and hurried toward the entrance. The Ministry of National Infrastructures was a quaint, serene place. The folks who worked there never had to worry about titanic power struggles over control of Israel's natural resources, because the country had precious little in the way of natural resources. Oil was nowhere to be found, and Israel's leaders had struggled for a generation to meet the country's energy needs. The man stepped up to the front desk. There was no line. "I'm here to speak to someone about the oil register," he murmured to the clerk. The clerk folded up his copy of Haaretz and peered at his log. "Do you have an appointment? I don't see a notation." "The Deputy Oil Commissioner indicated that I would not require an appointment," the man said quickly. "When we spoke on the phone, he said I could meet with someone when I arrived." The clerk grunted and muttered something under his breath. He picked up a handset and punched in a number. "Someone here to see Abe about the oil register." He nodded several times, then hung up the phone. "He'll be here in a second to take you back." "Abraham Zephron will see me? The Deputy Oil Commissioner?" "Yeah, Abe himself," the clerk laughed. "He's got nothing better to do right now. He might as well give you a guided tour of the register." The clerk held out his hand. The man looked at him confused. "Your identification papers?" the clerk said with irritation. "Oh, yes." The man extracted his personal passport from his suit jacket and handed it to the clerk, who copied the name down on his ledger and handed it back to the man. The man had a government passport as well, but chose not to use it here. The clerk barely glanced at the passport. Apparently, it wasn't all that surprising to see someone from Russia in Israel, even at the Ministry of National Infrastructures. The clerk handed the passport back to the man and returned to his newspaper. The man scanned the lobby. It was empty, save for the two of them. Then a door to one side opened, and an elderly man strode across the lobby. He was in short sleeves with no jacket. His shoes were worn and his tie angled off to one side. His gray hair was cropped close. He didn't look like a deputy oil commissioner, but the man hadn't really known what to expect. "Abraham Zephron?" The man extended a hand. "Please, just Abe," he answered. "We don't go on ceremony much around here." "I see. So, Abe, I called about the oil register." "Yes, I recall. I have it on my desk. We can look at it in my office." The man followed Abe Zephron to his office, a square, windowless office toward the back of the ground floor. Abe gestured to one of the two chairs in front of his cluttered desk, then moved to the other side. A battered leather binder perched on top of a pile of papers. It was held together by red electrical tape. "That's it?" the man asked. "That's Israel's oil register?" "It is," Abe smiled. "A sight to behold, isn't it?" The deputy oil minister opened the binder carefully. The crumpled pages inside seemed like they might disintegrate on touch. "How old is that book?" the man asked. "Don't know exactly," Abe said. "But there are exploration permits in here going back at least 30 years or so." "So, That holds all the permits, leases, licenses, everything? Abe nodded. Sure does. Only a handful of companies have had the courage or finances to go looking for oil, either onshore or off. But the big natural gas find last year off the coast of Tel Aviv? Sure took us all by surprise, Abe said. That was quite a shocker, hearing one of those areas held all that gas. Enough to meet Israel's energy needs for a decade, if I remember correctly. Assuming they can get at it, yes. But it looks like they'll be able to, doesn't it? Abe squinted one eye. That's what the newspapers say, I'll grant you that. The man decided not to press the issue further. He knew more than he was letting on about the huge natural gas find in the Mediterranean. But he was here to register an oil license, not gossip about Israel's energy needs. So, the man said casually, what do I need to do to secure a license in your register there? Abe turned the worn pages carefully. If I remember from our conversation, you said you had partnership papers, some preliminary geological surveys, and a check, and you'd like to register a license at the northern end of the Dead Sea, in a new area? Yes, that's correct. The man opened his briefcase, removed a folder, and handed a sheaf of papers to Abe. A check was stapled to the top of the file. Abe glanced at the papers and then at the check. It's all here, he said finally. This is what I'll need to start the process. Good, the man said. And I won't need anything else? Not right now, but can I ask you something? How'd you manage to get INOC to put a privately held limited partnership inside its Dead Sea partnership? That isn't easy. Israel's national oil company was state-owned and had been around since the 1950s. Most of its financing came from public investors, but some of its financing came from private or foreign groups outside Israel. INOC had been aggressively exploring 2 lease areas under licenses at the southern end of the Dead Sea. INOC's Dead Sea partnership had recently begun to drill for oil at the southern end of the Dead Sea, with some reports indicating that the drill site might yield small amounts of oil, somewhere between 100 to 200 barrels of oil daily. It was a tiny amount, but it was oil at least. No one had ever pursued anything at the northern end of the Dead Sea, though. INOC has its hands full at the southern end of the Dead Sea, the man said calmly. This gives them a piece of any action in an area they've never explored and don't have the resources to go after. I see. Abe raised an eyebrow. I guess that makes sense, but this paperwork says you have all the financing you need for a well-defined petroleum system and a viable geological conceptual model. You don't need any public financing? We have what we need. Assuming you find anything, Abe smiled. Yes, assuming we should find something at the northern end of the Dead Sea. Abe leaned back in his chair. It creaked and groaned. You do know that Israel is a terrible place to drill for oil, don't you? This isn't Iran. No one's ever had a whiff of anything like Gawar in Saudi Arabia. You're likely throwing money down the proverbial rat hole. The man didn't take the bait. As I said, we have what we need. And we know what we're getting into. We're here for the long haul. We've pledged a firm partnership with INOC on this and other matters. That's good, because no one's likely to get rich drilling for oil around here. Abe cocked his head toward the paperwork sitting on top of the oil register, loosely covering the electrical tape that kept the binder together. So, I have only one additional question. You mention in here that you might also be doing some work out in the Negev. Can you give me an idea of what you might be looking for exactly? The man stood to leave. As I said, we've pledged to be a good partner to INOC. They've asked us for some exploratory help in the Negev. We won't be digging, if that's what you're asking. I'm not sure what I'm asking, though I have heard rumors that someone has stepped forward to help INOC make the pipe that runs from Ashkelon to Eilat, two-way, in order to allow oil to flow North to south, and then out to China and the Far East, Abe said. It was just a question. And when we have an answer, the man replied, ignoring the first part of the obvious question, I'm fairly certain you'll be one of the first people to hear it. Abe stared hard at him. After a minute his gaze softened, as if he realized any further questions would be pointless. No answers would be forthcoming. Fair enough. But if you do happen across anything interesting, you'll be sure to pay me a visit again and let me know? Absolutely, the man said in earnest. Should we find anything interesting, you can be assured that I will be back to see you. The Dead Sea is a curious place, isn't it? The man didn't answer this question either. I'm sure we'll be in touch. He nodded politely. That would be nice. Abe closed the tattered oil register. We don't get many visitors around here. Chapter 2. Somewhere off the southern coast of Yemen. In range, Captain Samuel Bingham radioed to Vice Admiral Asher Truxton, who was listening in from a radio post at the U.S. Naval Base in Manama, Bahrain, hundreds of miles away. What do you see? Truxton asked. There was a brief pause. There are motorboats on one side, Bingham answered. The BPX is dead in the water. Our guys said they can see some activity on the decks. Any sign of the BPX sailors? Not that we can see, but we'll know more when we get closer, Bingham said. Vice Admiral Asher Truxton, fresh off his successful defense of the Strait of Hormuz during the brief conflict with Iran, was troubled. It was hard to imagine that pirates could threaten big ships like the BPX Limited in open waters on the high seas. But that seemed to be the case. Can you take control? Truxton asked. Samuel Bingham, captain of the USS John McCain, had read the reports. He knew what the BPX Limited meant to the pirates that roamed the high seas off Somalia and Yemen. It was worth more than a ransom. Its oil cargo was like black gold for the new breed of terrorism that was beginning to destabilize nation-states. I believe so, Bingham radioed back. The men are preparing to board. So, what do you make of the brief broadcast we got last night, right about when the pirates would have been coming aboard? About the crew shutting down the engines and then locking themselves inside the engine room? Yes, Truxton said. Do you buy it? Actually, ever since the Russians freed that crew from one of their own tankers, I do, Bingham answered. We've been told that they're training sailors on board to do more of that. The owners are moving away from hiring private security forces and opting to get their sailors out of the way of the pirates. So, you could board the ship. Yes, Admiral, we could. I'd like permission to go in full force, Bingham said. Truxton didn't hesitate. You have it. Thank you, sir. I'll report back as soon as I have news. The BPX Limited was an ugly ship. There were no visible markings and certainly nothing that might attract attention. So many heavy coats of paint had been applied over the years that it was nearly impossible to determine its original color. The BPX Limited's engines always churned loudly and unimpressively when it sailed through the seas 100 miles or so from the coastline of Yemen. But to the sailors aboard a mothership recently launched from the Somali town of Harar, Bingham knew the BPX Limited was a beautiful sight to behold. The ship might be ugly, but the light crude it carried was more wondrous than anything they could imagine. The oil was easily worth $50 million, even on the black market. The Harar pirate group had their orders, and they were relatively straightforward. Take the ship by force, secure the unarmed sailors aboard in the cargo hold, and move the ship away from the waters off the coasts of Yemen and Somalia as quickly as possible. This particular group of pirates had shifted its tactics in recent months, since pirating had become big business around the world. Gone were the days of targeting small passenger ships and extracting ransoms. Now the Harar pirates and several others had their sights on oil tankers and commercial ships. There was a market for their contents. Yes, both the EU and the United States Navy patrolled the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea, but they weren't fast enough to catch pirates using motherships and motorboats. What's more, Countries near Yemen and Somalia had grown weary of the chase and the efforts to lock pirates up. Some of the countries had already told the EU and the US that they would accept no more pirates. The pirates of Somalia also benefited from their relationship to al-Shabaab, the terrorist organization that had long tried to overthrow the government of Somalia. While the deals were 3 and 4 times removed from the high seas drama, the pirates discovered that someone, somewhere, was buying the oil from tankers such as this. And that funding, in return, set al-Shabaab up to be a force to be reckoned with on the global stage. Big money tended to do that. It allowed al-Shabaab to export its own notions of jihad to other parts of the world. It was hard to imagine, but 3 tankers nearly the same size as the BPX Limited and their oil cargo had simply vanished from the Arabian Sea in the past 6 months. Their crews were later found alive, wandering in either Yemen or Somalia. That's why Truxtun had chosen to redeploy a dozen Reapers from Afghanistan and Iraq for duty in the seas south of Yemen and Somalia. The pirates knew nothing of these drones, which at least gave the U.S. Navy some sort of an edge. The Reapers were all-seeing, with infrared eyes, and could fly for up to 18 hours at a time. Their cameras could look down on suspected pirates from 50,000 feet up, making them virtually invisible to the pirate motherships that launched from Harardhare and Hobia. The drones also could scan large areas for activity, so they were ideal in the vast waters where the pirates operated. The trick, of course, was to spot a hijacking in progress and get there in time to find the pirates still aboard. Convincing his superiors at the Joint Chiefs to redeploy so many Reapers away from Afghanistan had been a tough sell for Truxtun, but the change in pirate tactics to go after oil tankers had finally convinced the Pentagon leadership that more was going on than simple ransom hijackings. The pirates were beginning to fund terrorism, and that got the attention of the top brass at the Pentagon. One of the Reapers had picked up a mothership out of Harardhare 2 days ago, and just a day earlier it had made the connection between the BPX Limited and the mothership. So Truxtun had quickly deployed the USS McCain to intercept both. The firefight was intense but brief. Captain Bingham could see it from the deck of the McCain. The pirates had opened fire immediately. They were well armed, but no match for the American Navy. 2 of the pirates died in the gun battle. Another dozen, immediately arrested, were being detained aboard the McCain. Once the BPX had been secured and swept, Captain Bingham came aboard the oil tanker. They'd guessed right. There were no BPX sailors to be found. They were either dead and tossed off the ship or safely locked away. Minutes later, one of his men shouted over the radio that the BPX sailors had been found, alive and well, inside the engine room. A minute later, other forces that had simultaneously boarded the Harardhare pirate mothership also reported back. "All clear here," said one of the sailors under Bingham's command. "But—" "Yes?" Bingham asked. "Well, we found things here in the hold of the ship that don't make any sense." "Just report it, sailor," Bingham said patiently. "We'll make sense of it later." "We found boxes and boxes of white flags." "White flags?" "Yes, hundreds of them, all new, piles and piles in boxes." "Well, that's certainly interesting," Bingham mused. "And we found other things, maps of an overland route from Al-Hudaydah to Mecca." "Mecca? In Saudi Arabia?" "Yes, sir. It appears to largely follow the coast, and there's one other thing." Bingham smiled. "I can only imagine." "There's a cache of weapons on one side of the hold," the sailor reported. "But they're useless." "Because?" "They're only a bunch of double-edged swords, worthless in a fight. No one's fought with swords like these in 100 years. I can't imagine what they're for or why they're here." "I can't either, but there's a logical reason for everything, and someone will make sense of this, I'll hazard." "Flags? Swords and a route to Mecca? That makes sense?" "It certainly makes sense to someone," Bingham answered.